Hey, so welcome back. This is Module 8. We're going to do Section 8.1, and let's get started. All right, so one thing you're going to notice here is what we're doing, and these two sentences really sum up things pretty well. There's a regression analysis that we did in Module 6, and it was a relationship between two quantitative variables. So remember we had linear relationships of scatter plot things, right? And then on this axis would be X and this would be Y, and we'd find some nice fit through that data. That was regression analysis. What we're going to do today in the next couple of videos is chi-square tests, and they are slightly different in that we're going to look at the relationship between two categorical variables. Now, in this data set that we have here, we're talking about heart disease and snoring. Okay, so we've got two categorical variables, and they are heart disease and snoring. We want to know if there's a relationship between these two categorical variables. So we're going to use charts like this in order to determine these questions of the relationships. Before we get into that, though, we need to do a little bit of arithmetic with these tables so that you understand what's going on. The very first thing we're going to look at, let's come over here to Excel. In order to prepare to answer these questions, there's one step that they don't always explain. They sort of showed it in the workbook, but let's talk about it. We're going to total up these different columns and rows. So in this column, we're going to say the sum of these two values. And so that I don't have to copy that over and over, I can just drag that across there. Okay. I'm going to do the same up here, so that's equals sum of all these things, and then I'm going to copy Control D, will copy down, and then I'm going to do another Control D, and this is the grand total. Awesome. So now we have the totals of these columns and the total of these rows, and we're going to need those numbers here in a second. But let's start with the first question. What proportion of individuals have heart disease and snore nearly every night? Questions 1 and 2, it mentions here, ask for joint proportions. Now, the joint usually refers to any one of these being divided by the grand total. So in other words, here we have individuals that have heart disease. So we're going to look along this row and snore nearly every night. Well, that's only this one cell. So we're going to take that one cell, we're going to divide it by the grand total. And that should be the value that you'll get if you did that correctly. What proportion of individuals have heart disease and are non-snorers? So again, we're also still on the yes row, and we need to go over to non-snorers, which is 24. So we're going to use that cell, divide it by the grand total, and there's your number for that one. For marginal proportions, we're always talking about the things on the margins here. We're going to use one of these numbers divided by the grand total. So let's look at this one. Number 3, what proportion of individuals have heart disease? All right. So this whole row are people that have heart disease. So we're going to take that total divided by the grand total to get our answer. So equals that cell divided by the grand total. Number 4, what proportion of individuals snore every night? Snore every night is right here. That's these two groups. So we're going to say this cell, or this marginal number here, 254, divided by the grand total. And that's your number. Number 5, what proportion of individuals who snore nearly every night have heart disease? So now we're talking about conditional proportions. And these are only slightly different. They're not too bad. Usually it's going to be one of these cells divided by its total, whatever that may be. Okay, or one of these divided by its total. So you really have to read these questions carefully. So let's look at it again. What proportion of individuals who snore nearly every night have heart disease? So of all the people that snore nearly every night, there's 213 of them. How many of them have heart disease? Well, it's going to be 21 divided by 213. So we take that cell, divided by the total on that column, for 9.86% about. Number 6, what proportion of individuals who have heart disease snore nearly every night? Okay, so all these folks are the ones that have heart disease, so there's 110 of them, and 21 out of 110 of them snore every night. So we're going to say equals 21 divided by 110 for that answer. Note that the last two questions above are different from 1 through 4. They have the same numerator but different denominators. Like I said, we're going to be dividing for these conditionals by these last rows. So find the conditional distribution of heart disease for non-snorers by filling in the blanks. Proportion of non-snorers with heart disease. We're going to look at the non-snorers with heart disease. Okay? So that equals 24 divided by 1379. Non-snorers without heart disease. Well, that's the remainder of it. Okay, so we can either take this and divide it by 1379, or because we know it's the remainder of them, you could have said 1 minus this proportion for that same value. Okay, so just two different ways to get to that same answer. 8a, find the proportion with heart disease for remaining snoring groups. All right, actually what I'm going to do for these, I'm going to let you guys do them. And probably most of you have done the pre-work already, so you can get to those answers. And WebAssign, of course, will tell you if you're wrong or right. All right, so let's go back into the workbook. Back in the in-class activity, that's what we're going to start on now. Number 1, we're going to take a set of those calculations we did and we're going to put them in these boxes. So once again, let's shoot back over into Excel. This can be really easy once you know where you're supposed to make these calculations. So for this one, it's the proportion with heart disease that are in each of these categories. So we're going to say that it's the heart disease folks divided by the total in that column. Now, so I don't have to keep typing, I can just drag this across there, and we have all the values. Now each of these values are what we're going to write into these boxes. But before we do that, what we like to do is make a bar chart. Let's do that by actually putting these titles above. We're going to copy all this data, we're going to select all this data and go to insert. Let's see, there's a bar chart. Is that a bar chart? There it is. We could put titles and everything on it, of course, but this is the bar chart that you would simply show in your workbook, or at least show that you could do it, right? Cool. So let's go back to the workbook and answer some questions about this. Number 3, if snoring is not related to heart disease, then the proportion with heart disease in each snoring group should all be the same. Based on your work above, does there seem to be a relationship between heart disease and snoring behavior? Looking at this graph, they clearly don't look like they're all the same, so I would say it looks like there is a relationship. I can't tell if it's significant or not based on just looking at this, but certainly it looks like there's something going on. So in part B, which of the hypotheses below seem most supported by the data? I would say that there is a relationship. Okay, now we get to the fun stuff. Now, I want to preface this by saying that most students over the years actually really get this part, or they get this really well, for a couple reasons. One reason, you understand this 4-step process fairly well now, and 2, the calculations in this seem pretty straightforward. And so I hope that works out for you, but let's get into it. So step 1, state the hypothesis. This is a pretty easy one to do because you don't have to come up with some formula. You can simply state it. So in other words, the null hypothesis is, in this case, that heart disease, I'm going to abbreviate this, and snoring are not related. That kind of follows what we've said in the past. There's no difference, or things are equal. In this case, it's that they're not related. All right, and the alternative hypothesis is that they are related. Okay. Step 2, check conditions by answering the questions below. Is the data from a random sample? Well, I don't think it tells us exactly, so we're going to say assume random. Do at least 80% of the cells have a count of at least 5? And we look at the count. I'll go over here to Excel, look at that real quick. Every one of these cells looks like it has a count of at least 5. So yes, yes. Is the population size at least 10 times the sample size? I would say yes also, right? If we think about all the people who have heart disease, whether they snore or don't snore, all that stuff. Step 3, find the chi-square test statistic value and p-value by following the steps below. All right, so for each cell in the original two-way table, find the row total times the column total divided by the grand total, and write this number in the cell across the diagonal. So what they said is the row total, which is this, and we're going to times that by the column total, and then we're going to divide that by the grand total. We get 61.06. Now, if you're looking at your workbook, you'll see the number 66. Well, some of you will. Depends on what version you have. That number is wrong if it's 66. 61.066 blah, blah, blah is correct. So we just keep doing that for every one of these cells. So this one is going to be this row total, times this column total divided by this grand total. Well, if I could quit messing up. All right, so this one would be 28.253. And we're going to keep doing that. I'm going to cut here. Okay, so now that that's done, these are the counts we expect if the null hypothesis were true. In other words, what I've done by taking these totals and dividing them by the grand total is saying that 61.06 is what the number or the count should be for people who have heart disease and are non-snorers, and so forth and so on for each of these values. That's what it should be if there were no relationship between the two. Okay, that's the numbers you should get. I'll let you think about that, noodle on that for a little bit. Meanwhile, I'm going to go to the next step. All right. Second, for each cell, find the observed count minus the expected count, square it, and then divide by the expected count. It shows us that it is the observed count, and the observed count is 24, minus the expected count, which is 61.06, blah, blah, blah. And we're going to square that number. And then we're going to divide that by the expected count, 61 point whatever, again. Hit enter. And that's a number that we have. Right. So now I can just actually paste this all the way. These are all the values that I would get from that next calculation. Third, we're going to add up the 8 numbers. So all 8 of these numbers, we're going to add them up. And we'll do that in a formula. Equals sum. Add up all these numbers. Chi-square test statistic. All right. Then we want to find the degrees of freedom. And the degrees of freedom are equal to the row count minus 1 times the column count minus 1. So in this case, the row count is 2. So that's just going to be equals 2 minus 1 times the column count, which is 4 minus 1. Or, as you might have guessed, 3. So, this is your degrees of freedom. Cool. Now, with that number and this number, so these two numbers here that I'm putting in yellow, we could look at a chi-squared table, and you will have access to that, of course, in the resources section. You could figure out what the p-value should be for that. And certainly we could do that. am here to tell you, though, that Excel has this functionality. So I'm going to show that to you. And it is chi-squared distribution. And then it shows you the x that we care about, the degrees of freedom. And remember I said this cumulative is always true. So we get 1. Now, you might do this and go, hey, you know what? My table tells me 0, and you would be correct. It probably should be 0. What this is showing me by the value it gave me is that this is the area under the curve to the left of the value 72.78. Okay, so that's quite a big number. That's basically all of it, right? Is under that to the left. But what we care about is what's to the right of it. So, and you can do that one of two ways. One way is to say 1 minus this number. That gives you everything to the right, which is about 0%. Or, just to check our work here, we could do chi-squared dist.rt, and then you pick this value again, comma the degrees of freedom, enter, and you get one of those funky numbers. But as you'll notice, right, that's 10 to the negative 15th. That's really, really, really small number. This number is essentially 0. Okay? All right, so that is step 3. So come back to step 4 in your workbook, and let's talk about what we found. All right, we've discovered that the p-value is equal to basically 0. So that tells us, as it always does, to reject the null hypothesis. It also tells us to say there is significant evidence to suggest that heart disease and snoring are related. Voila. We're done. That's it. That's all there was to that. What I suggest you do, going from here, you have the solutions already at your fingertips. I would go through these problems, the rest of them, and try to understand what's going on with each one of these. They might show you a couple tiny new things here and there, but for the most part, it's exactly what I did. So, having said that, we are done with 8-1. I will see you in the next video.